The United Auto Workers strike against General Motors is now in its 16th day. Negotiations are continuing, and it's starting to have a major economic effect in many places, especially in the Midwest. NBC's chief economics correspondent Mike Jensen reports on the strike and its effects.
16 more GM parts plants entirely or partly shut down, including this one in Pennsylvania.
Well, nobody really wants to be out here, but we're going to be out here until we've got this worked out.
General Motors, America's biggest manufacturer, now has laid off more than 150,000 employees at more than 100 plants, with a growing ripple effect. The Midwest economy hit especially hard, hurting those least able to afford it.
Clearly, the smaller businesses, the ones who service many of these production plants, are the hardest hit.
The ripple effect means other big companies also feel the pain, including Caterpillar, which makes GM engines and is planning layoffs next week. Bethlehem Steel hit in the pocketbook. Seatbelt and airbag and electronic companies. If the strike lasts much longer, it will slow down the national economy.
GM produces about $1 out of every $100 in the economy, so it's important. When it closes down, it's a matter of concern.
The issue for GM is what's called outsourcing, ordering parts from outside companies because it's cheaper. Ford and Chrysler already do more of that than GM. For the Auto Workers Union, it's all about jobs, mostly protecting those they have.
The issue is outsourcing, and we got to stay firm on that because a lot of jobs are being lost because of it.
There's a lot of job anxiety in America, and the strike and GM layoffs are making it even worse. But Wall Street loves it. GM made almost $7 billion in profits last year. And analysts say it could make even more money by using outside suppliers for parts. GM stock has actually gone up $2 a share since the strike began. Mike Jensen, NBC News, New York.
To discuss the United Auto Workers strike this morning, we have two guests in our Washington studio. James Thomas, who is director of the Cooper Management Institute. He has specialized over the years in the negotiation of disputes. He's been involved in labor negotiations, arms control, trade, and diplomatic issues, among others. In Chicago is Aaron Fawcett, who is Assistant Vice President for Domestic Economy at the First Chicago Bank. And good morning to both of you. And Ms. Fawcett, let's start with you. Some have called this the worst blow to the Midwest economy in several years. How bad does the strike hurt the economy in the Midwest?
Well, I think the economic impact is by no question very tremendous. Some people have likened it to the flood effects in 1993, and I think that's a fair comparison. I think what is important to remember, though, is following the floods in 1993, we had a real burst of economic activity. This is growth that is disrupted. It's not growth that is lost. So I think while up front we are looking for a significant disruption in economic activity, I think we will recoup most of these losses later on.
They would recoup even though General Motors, we are told, is losing something like $350 million a week and all of the lost wages. And so when this is finally settled, let's say in the next few days, in a couple of weeks, the economy can come back and most people will recoup this?
I think we will see a significant turnaround in the employment figures and the income figures in April and May. But again, I think the first quarter is really going to be a loss as far as growth. I think if this strike continues much into next week, we could be looking at negative growth in the first quarter of this year. But I think the important thing is that we will recoup that in the second quarter. We could see as much as 3.5% growth in the second quarter. So eventually most of these losses will be recouped. You know, there's no question, though, that many people are facing some near-term pain.
All right, Mr. Thomas, let's talk about the negotiations then. You've been involved in many over the years. You're not involved in this particular negotiation. The GM board, apparently there are members on that board that are taking a very hard line. They're drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is it, we're going to make this happen. What about those negotiations?
Well, I don't think they've gotten off to a very auspicious start. I think the parties didn't even talk for about the first 2 weeks after the strike. GM no-showed last week for a Thursday scheduled meeting, and now finally on Sunday, I think we've gone into marathon meetings with a complete news blackout. But GM's recent attempt to block unemployment benefits to the workers in most of the states is very unusual, and I think probably is not a very good sign.
As you're talking about this strike right now, it comes at a rather strange time. The stock market is doing very well, but the signs in the rest of the economy are not all that good, and a lot of people in all segments of the economy are worried about layoffs and downsizing. We hear about that constantly, and that's obviously what the GM workers are worried about down the line, isn't it?
Well, certainly that is the case. And of course, GM feels that it is really up against a serious economic challenge now in that because its principal competitors in the big three, Ford and Chrysler, are much more efficient in terms of outsourcing their parts. GM feels that it's not competitive, and in order to stay competitive with a consumer economy, by the way, that is increasingly price sensitive, in order to stay competitive, it's forced to do what it has to do now.
Let's take a look at this from a little bit larger context than just the General Motors strike, though, because we know that labor union membership has gone down in recent years. People have talked about the declining power of the unions. Do you think that maybe the union is saying now, we're going to stand right here, we're going to draw our line in the sand, while the management is doing the same thing? And how do you feel about the long-term possibilities of getting a settlement here?
Your references to drawing lines in the sand, I think, are very apt. This is beginning to look a little bit like Gettysburg, where you have the definitive battle of the war at a time when neither party was really prepared for it or really was considering such a battle. The unions have for some time planned on spending millions of dollars to build up what they see as a decline in union power, so this looks like it might be a good opportunity.
All right, our guests will stay with us. We will continue our conversation on the General Motors Corporation strike. We will take your phone calls right here at 1-800-988-TALK. But first of all, a word from the people at Folgers Coffee. Welcome back to Wake Up America. We're discussing labor negotiations and, of course, the General Motors strike with our guest, James Thomas, who is director of the Cooper Management Institute. He is in Washington, and Aaron Fawcett, who is Assistant Vice President, Domestic Economy with the First Chicago Bank. You can dial us up here at 1-800-988-TALK to join the conversation. And Ms. Fawcett, I'd like to ask you again about the economy, because there was that old saying years ago that so goes Detroit, or so goes General Motors, so goes the nation. The auto industry now is not what it used to be, but it still comes up with about 1% of the domestic gross product, does it not? And a long-term effect, a long-term strike obviously could still have a major effect.
Well, I do think that's certainly true, but I think one thing that's important to remember is as the strike continues, I think we will start to see some offsets. Both Chrysler and Ford are going to be gearing up to try to gain some market share out of this. Also, if you look at a place like Ohio, GM used to be the primary employer in that state, and now I think Honda is at least as big a player as GM. And so there are certainly other players in this marketplace right now, and where I think that, certainly the impact from a GM strike will be very tremendous in the near term. I think that we will start to see offsets. Another factor, too, is I think both parties are going to start to lose exponentially if the strike continues much into next week. Workers will be doing without their wages, and GM's going to find themselves more and more vulnerable in the light truck market. And that's really their Achilles heel. Inventories are very low. That's where they're facing the most competition from Ford and Chrysler. So I think both parties are really getting to a point where they have some incentive to come to some sort of settlement.
Mr. Thomas, let me ask you to look into your crystal ball, if you will, and I realize you're not directly involved in these negotiations. Clearly it'll be settled at some point. Clearly there will be some kind of compromise. Make a guess as to what that might be.
I would expect that there will be an agreement whereby GM will strive to make its affiliated UAW plants more cost effective. At the current time, they cost anywhere from 20 to 30% more than outside sources. So accordingly, you do have that pressure to outsource. If they could be made more cost competitive, the pressure to outsource would not be so great. And in addition, it's worth noting that when you outsource parts, you also outsource profits. It's also, I think, from a deadline perspective, if the strike goes on 2 more months, it's going to delay the introduction of the 1977 models. So I think between now and 2 months from now, you're almost certain to see a resolution.
All right, we have some phone calls now. Carolyn from Florida, you're on the air this morning. Good morning. Your question or comment?
Yes, hello.
Yes.
I saw a comment, a statistic last night, I believe it was on the Financial Network, saying that the automobile industry has had a net gain of 155,000 jobs since 1992. And since it's so widely believed that the industry has lost jobs, I wondered what the comment would be on that. And if it seems to be due to outsourcing, wouldn't it appear that the loss at GM or one of those companies would be a gain for the workers at, you mentioned Caterpillar and some of those companies. So I'd be interested to hear your comment on that.
Do either of you have a comment upon that with this caveat? If that is the case and 155,000 people have been employed or jobs have been created in the last couple of years, wouldn't that be auxiliary industries, some of the outsourcing we're talking about, and maybe the benefits and the pay wouldn't be as high? Do either of you want to comment on that?
Well, I can speak to that.
Okay.
I can't actually comment on the actual number,
right,
but I do know offhand We've had more and more foreign producers moving into the U.S. economy to produce cars. There's been more and more pressure on those producers to use American-made supplies, American-made parts. And so we are seeing more of a ripple effect throughout the economy. Some of the traditional supplier networks are certainly changing. However, I do think we are exporting more cars out of this country, and I do think that many of the auxiliary producers, as far as parts and supplies, have been able to really gain from some of the trade flows that have been going on.
All right, Marie from Georgia, you're on the air. Good morning. Yes, Marie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, go ahead.
I had never been a big fan of labor unions, but I'm a fan of people who are willing to work. They are paid enough to support their families. I think the government should take some of the responsibility. That maybe if GM didn't have to pay so much money in taxes for the government to turn around and give it away, that they maybe could pay higher wages and still make a profit. And maybe the government should offer some sort of forms of tax incentives through tax breaks or tax reductions for the companies in response for them paying higher than average wages to their employees.
Well, some of those things are being done now. And Mr. Thomas, let me ask you about people look at General Motors stock. It went up $2 last week when they went on strike, and yet they're losing $350 million a week. It's difficult for the average person to understand that. And I know that the Labor Secretary, Robert Reich, said a few weeks ago, who are the companies being run for? The stockholders, obviously, they own the company, but they're being run for the employees. People find it very difficult to understand how a company can make a lot more money by laying people off and yet affecting so many people's lives.
GM has made a decision that it's going to be enduring some short-term discomfort in order to gain some long-term benefits. Its principal competitors, Ford and Chrysler, during the 80s went through the entire recession downsizing thing. GM didn't. And now it's paying a price because obviously its locally manufactured content is much higher than those of its competitors. So it feels now that it really has to remake the shape of the corporation, regain management's initiative in order to maintain its competitive position.
All right, Pam from California, you're on the air. We have about 30 seconds, very quickly.
Good morning. I was just calling to say that I would like to see the UAW get more of the other unions involved. I'd like to see all companies make money, but I don't like to see employees be forgotten and left out, families lose their homes for a profit.
All right, Mr. Thomas, a quick final comment, and Ms. Fawcett, you can have one too, about 10 seconds.
I think we can work out some agreement with inclusive bargaining and a lack of aggressive and antagonistic rhetoric that benefits all the players and can all profit more.
Okay, Ms. Fawcett?
Well, I think it's worth commenting, too, that the average salary at the GM plant that went on strike was close to $70,000 a year. I think that runs into some problem when you talk about solidarity, because some of the workers at the suppliers were making about half to one-third of that salary.
All right. Thank you very much, both of you.